One of the currents that we look at is, what some people call like disaster environmentalism. This is just going to be a civilizational collapse, and we're just not going to be able to protect and support everyone. And so people are going to have to die, right? That was one of the kind of animating impulses of early environmentalism. It's hard to deny that there's going to have to be some challenges and some trade-offs and unlimited growth in the way that is organized now. It doesn't seem realistic, but I want to be a little bit more optimistic. I think there's a way to sort of more equitably manage our resources and provide for everyone. I just hope that we can kind of look out for each other through that, rather than sort of come to these conclusions.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political, and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Gordon Katic. Gordon is a radio producer and a science journalist who's studying a PhD in science communication, whilst also running Cited Media, the podcast company that he founded over a decade ago that has gone on to win multiple awards for its innovative method of collaborative and plural podcast production. Cited Media is not a top-down production company. They make podcasts from the bottom up, working very closely with academic researchers, activists, and communities to co-discover the topic of each season and the necessary research that has to go into it. It's a very different form of journalism, and I'm really excited to announce that they have a big eco season coming out in the first week of September called Green Dreams. And I invited Gordon on to discuss it. And of course, we don't really end up discussing it exactly. We end up having a conversation about this big picture eco crisis through which he weaves a huge amount of information that he's learned from interviewing experts and community members, and even interestingly, sort of the problem of Western intellectual expertise when considering the eco crisis. And so we do that for the vast majority of the episode. And towards the end, Gordon then explains his research process, exactly what they do at Cited Media, and offers a couple of nuggets of wisdom that he's learned through the process of doing his PhD. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter inspired by each episode delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community, who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who believe in Planet Critical and keep the project going every week. Gordon, welcome to Planet Critical. It is a pleasure to have you on the show.
Such a pleasure to be here, Rachel. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really honored to take part in the really great conversation that you're having with the podcast and with the newsletter.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm very excited to see what we get into, but you know the drill before we get there. Why is the world in crisis?
Yeah, I guess I got a few thoughts. I just, I guess it's maybe a boring answer, but like there's money to be made in that crisis. Like it's in people's financial interest to continue that crisis. And of course, there are many more people that would rather that we not have the crisis that we're in, the environmental crisis, the economic crisis, the many interlocking crises. But there's oil to be drilled. There's weapons to be sold. I don't know if it's much more complicated than that, really.
Interesting. I don't think anybody's ever sort of come at it from that point before. Do you think that the people who are making the big bucks, like Trump, for example, and I read a headline. I didn't check it, but I read a headline the other day that him and his family have raked in $3.6 billion already since his inauguration, just milking the presidency for all of its worth.
Absolutely. Huge crypto scams, right?
He's such a scam artist. Do you think that people like him are aware of the extent of the crisis?
Um, well, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's sort of like hard to accept the reality of the destructive force that you are and can be when you're making so much hay off it. You're making so much money off of it, right? I mean, there's just like, there's no incentive to have that kind of critical introspection that will force you to change. And every sort of material and structural incentive pushes you the other way,
Mm.
right? So, like with the climate crisis, for instance, I've always been the sort of person that thinks it's, less to do with our like attitudes. I think I'm a bit of an outlier. I'm not very like green, I guess. Like
Mm.
I'm not very into nature or very like, I'm not very into hiking or camping. So in that sense, I'm kind of like a bad environmentalist. But I'm sure you could identify many oil and gas executives that are very into hiking
Mm.
and into nature and have
Mm.
very good attitudes about the natural world. But the environment in which they labor, the role that they have within our society is such that it pushes them to do something else. So
Mm.
whether or not they realize it, I'm not really sure. They probably can't. I mean, there's probably some sort of cognitive dissonance. I don't want to get too
Mhm.
much into Trump's psychology. I think he probably just doesn't care.
Yeah.
But for kind of well-meaning people that are profiting from the climate crisis or from continued wars, there's probably some sort of psychological gymnastics that they do
Mhm.
to sort of insulate themselves, I guess, would be the way that I think of it.
Yeah, interesting. I completely agree with you. I think that one of like the failings of the campaign, I would say, from the left and the climate campaign, and also caveat everyone, climate is not the only problem here, but that is kind of the
Mhm.
mainstream, descriptor for it, has been to portray, these people who are in charge of oil companies or making political decisions as evil and morally
Mhm.
bankrupt. And it's like, well, they're just anybody in their role would have to do that. That's just the way that things work. They're on a treadmill that was started hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and it's incredibly difficult to get off. Not impossible, but I don't think that we should be looking to these people as leaders who are making deliberately bad choices. They are followers who are making the only choice that they think is available to them in some way.
Yeah, and I think in some way that's more optimistic
Mm.
because it's easier to change the structures within our society than to say that there are these people who are just pathologically and irredeemably evil and want our planet to be destroyed. I mean, if that were the case, I think we'd be in, big trouble. I'm sure there are maybe some
I
like
mean,
like
Trump.
maybe Elon Musk doesn't, yeah, maybe Trump, maybe Elon Musk doesn't care,
Yeah.
but I mean the kind of rank and file of say the oil and gas industry, for instance.
Yeah.
I mean, most of these people are probably decent people, and to the inverse of this, I'm sure we've all been in spaces, sort of left leaning spaces, with people that are complete assholes, right? And
Yes.
then and then you and then you meet some like business bro or something, and like he or she or whatever is like really nice to you, and you're
Yeah.
like kind of surprised.
Yeah.
So yeah, I tend to think of it as more, like I said, more structural.
So should we offer a little hypothesis then? Is it easier to kind of join in on a narrative that actually disempowers the populace by saying they're evil, there's something wrong with them psychologically, rather than go, there is a mass amount of structural change that needs to happen. We are going to have to find out different offerings and different
Hmm.
incentives in order to encourage people or systems to change, or even this started hundreds of years ago and it's incredibly difficult, and maybe it just won't stop until somebody unplugs the treadmill. Like, all of that is a much more complicated conversation than just saying those people are morally bankrupt because of their class, their race, their history, or just by virtue of who they work for.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? So like I guess to sort of summarize that, if I got it correctly, it's
Mm.
like the structural kind of more amorphous structural historical sort of take is harder to grasp, I
Yeah.
guess, and it's easier to say, "Hey, bad guy over there."
Mm.
I think there's something to that, right? In the world of like sort of political mobilizing and sloganeering, we could probably use some bad guys that we want to like name and shame and I'm not above that. I'm not going to try and like, take some sort of moral high ground here. Um, but like maybe there's also something galvanizing about like building a new world together,
Yeah.
right? And there's maybe something galvanizing about social solidarity,
Mm.
right? I mean, like, not to sort of ruthlessly plug Green Dreams, the podcast series I want to talk about a little bit, but one of our episodes looks at deep ecology and Earth First and some tensions within that movement in the 90s. And there were sort of different camps. One camp was very, very antagonistic to working class loggers and
Mm.
others who, in their sort of day to day labor, were really destroying old growth forests. And another camp uh, came from more of a labor organizing background and was much more committed to this idea of solidarity with
Mm.
working people, that they could actually be allies, right? And that caused this sort of huge tension. But I think kind of in the grand scheme of things, that more solidaristic approach is kind of more likely to create the kind of mass social change that's necessary.
Mhm.
Because if it's good guys and bad guys, I mean, there's a lot of people that are be like, gonna say, well, I guess I'll be one of the bad guys,
Mhm.
or
Mhm.
no, no, screw you, you're the bad guy.
Mhm. Mhm. I think that that is all. It's such a good point. I mean, the way that the environmental movement has typically abandoned the working class and the labor movement in the Western world, at the very least, has been a huge ongoing problem. And misunderstanding sort of the necessities why certain people engage in certain either behaviors or industries or whatever. I'm thinking about Paul Rosalie, who I had on the show years ago, and he's done really particularly fascinating work in the Amazon, um, creating an organization that employs former logging employees,
Hmm.
locals, as what does he call them? Like rainforest protectors, Amazon guardians, something. And he's really, really tried to shine a light on the fact that these people are not bad people. They need a job. They need money. They need to feed their
Yeah.
families. And if the only thing available is a logging company, then lo and behold, that's who they're going to work for. And it's nothing to do with the fabric of their moral character and more to do with necessity, need. Just to add a sort of another concrete example to what you're saying. And I think it's something that is often forgotten. And even in the case of, you know, the big executives at the top, they will also have what they perceive as needs, and be trying to meet those needs, even if to, us old, lowly, normal people, we can't really understand why they need 2 skiing holidays a year, but still, apparently they feel that they do. And that's enough to kind of incentivize the behavior.
Yeah, or two yachts, or two palatial mansions. Yeah. We all have needs. If only mine could be so. If only I could be so needy. I mean, another person that comes to mind. I know you had them on the show, Matt Huber, right? I mean,
Mm.
takes a real sort of class-oriented approach to climate change, which resonates with me to a certain extent. Another sort of little story I remember when I was doing my master's degree, long, long time ago. It was about sort of anarcho-primitivism and kind of anarchist
Mm.
sort of takes on environmental struggle. And I had this sort of anarchist theorist on my committee, but a very labor-oriented one. And he was from Windsor, which is basically, for American listeners, Windsor is sort of across the bridge there from Detroit. So it's an old kind of auto center. And I remember him telling me, I don't remember which environmental group it was, but there were some protests about the auto industry and some of their emissions or dumping or something like that. And he was like a labor organizer, but also an environmentalist. And he was telling me about how these auto workers were, just being kind of yelled at
Mm.
by these kind of, white upper middle class environmentalists, really, really unproductive social tension. And the thing he told me was like, these environmentalists didn't realize that even these auto workers were themselves environmentalists, just in a way that wasn't totally intelligible to them, because they were on the assembly line calling out, instances of waste.
Mm.
They were even doing kind of like little subterfuge and industrial sabotage to
Excellent.
stop practices that they thought were needlessly destructive or needlessly wasteful. But that just doesn't register because that's not like we don't look at auto worker making truck as environmentalists. But in theory, they could be, and they very well might be.
Oh God, I love that. I think that's I absolutely love that, and I immediately am like, I just would love to interview somebody that did
Yeah,
that, that engaged in these sort of like micro sabotages of industry. But I
I'll
think
have
that,
to reconnect with them.
oh
Yeah,
God,
I'm
yeah,
so curious.
please.
Yeah,
But I think that kind of action is incredibly important. And I recognize we're sort of really going off on a tangent here down this branch that we've started. But I do think that that kind of action is inherently important. I've been thinking a lot because I've been writing about it for the book. I sort of added in an extra chapter to deal with this question. But there's an element of reifying existing power structures when protest essentially goes to the halls of power, or at least the front door, and
yes.
says, you need to change something. We are not happy with X. We want Y. You're still
Hmm.
insisting that the power structures that remain essentially listen to you, acquiesce to you, and then make the changes that you deem are necessary. And like,
Right.
sure, that's how a democracy is meant to be, fine. But when state power is so intimately intertwined with fossil fuel power or whatever other power that comes from the exploitation of living bodies, then essentially there is an element of saying, we accept all of that systemic stuff going on there to put you in that position of power. We just want you to change some of your behavior. And that's when
Hmm.
I really rate sort of the anarchists' critique, that kind of want to tear the whole thing down and go,
Yeah.
nah, it's rotten all the way to its core. It's rotten all the way to its core, and that's why it's not going to change. And that's why our form of protest has to take different shapes.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I'm kind of ambivalent, right? I'm torn between these two sort of different positions, right? I mean, you can kind of crudely put it as like big environmentalism or even just like big politics, right?
Mm.
Versus kind of creating the world that you want to live in. And, I think there's a tendency to kind of, go your own way and have these little, enclaves or eco villages that tend to be sort of, are you really making a different world, or is that just sort of escapism, right? So
Yeah.
there's a critique of that, right? And when things are so urgent, you do need to have like, you know, big policy change, which requires making these demands upon the existing order. But to your point, I think, there's a danger in that too, right? There's a danger of being sort of like co-opted or just sort of settling for less and just not realizing also just like sort of disempowering yourself to,
Yeah.
right? Like the auto workers that are doing those little, acts of industrial sabotage, like that's maybe more effective than telling the boss to sort of change, right? I mean, just
Mm-hmm.
make it happen.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned eco villages, and now that's where I'm sort of stuck at. Um, because it's a bit of a thing at the moment with people like discussing their exit plans. Essentially,
Yes.
as things get really, really, really bad. And I shouldn't be laughing because it's all very sad and serious. But if you don't laugh, you'll cry.
Yeah.
Uh, and I've been just to kind of bring in Tyson Yunkaporta, who I interviewed recently, because his everything he said is still ringing around my head. Um, I think that it's a bit of a pipe dream, a lot of
Mhm.
these kinds of projects, because it is such a mammoth task to ask people who are educated and cultured in the weird way, Western educated, industrialized,
Yeah.
rich, democratic, who, whether we like it or not, come from this hyper competitive, hyper individualistic society to suddenly go into communal life and for that to just work. I
Yes.
think it's a pipe. I genuinely think it's a pipe dream. And I was thinking about it the other day, and I was like, God, I wish we could just have, like, if each of these projects, not necessarily eco villages, but like leftist projects that are trying to erase hierarchies and do things collaboratively and essentially always brush up against egos, and you just hear story after story of them failing. It's like, I wish we could all have an elder. I wish that
Hmm.
we could all have just magically appear an Aboriginal elder or an elder from a different culture that has lived this, that knows this in
Right.
their bones and expects it to be difficult, and who could be that authority to just tell people,
Mm.
shut up. No, that's shut up. That's not how it works. You need to do it this way.
Yeah.
Because I can't really see the left kind of getting out of its, and the left just got itself all tangled up, I think, in recent years. And I'm speaking to both what we've been discussing with regards to the reification of power and like big politics, but also with regards to its exit strategies. Just a
Yeah.
bit toothless.
I mean, there's so many things about eco villages. We could make this whole conversation about that. I mean, it was so long ago that I did this master's thesis, but it really struck me. I mean, the first thing I'll say about eco villages, in terms of its how realistic it is, you look around at these people, like they were all very wealthy, upper middle class white people,
Mm-hmm.
mostly like who worked in tech. They're mostly from California and Oregon, even though
Mm.
my work was in DC. They were an incredibly privileged and unusual group of people that could actually, create this kind of world, right? Landowners, for one, with
Mm.
enormous savings that they had, amassed during a, whatever tech boom that was. So how accessible, right, is that world? Let alone your brilliant point about just like, do we have those kind of radical democratic muscles, right?
Yeah.
It's a process. You can't just sort of drop yourself in and be like, I am in a collectively managed, radically democratic environment.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
but also like the labor of working in an eco village, I mean, quite ableist.
Mm.
And to the extent I remember reading something about one of the name escapes me now, but they were one of the sort of very, um, prominent eco-village theorists. I was at some conference, a journalist asked them, well, what if you're, differently abled and you can't labor on the land in this way?
Mm.
And they were so dismissive and basically saw, impending civilizational collapse and just said, well, we can't save everyone.
Oh my God.
That was essentially the message. It was even worse than that, actually. And
What?
that that really struck me because it was, yeah, it's this, I mean, a lot of these sort of countercultural communities are sort of like that, right? I
Mm.
mean, they see themselves as pioneers, right? And pioneers are and we can't all be pioneers.
Oh, get a grip.
Yes, exactly.
How sad. I mean, I think that, like, it is an important conversation as we have less energy resources and material resources. How are we going to actively redirect
Hmm.
towards our most important industries, some of which will be healthcare? I had someone on the show recently talk about how do we degrow healthcare to ensure that we're no
Interesting.
longer kind of doing these unnecessary medical
Yes,
interventions and
yes.
take a more holistic approach, et cetera, et cetera. But the idea of just what you leave people behind. I mean, that's how could you possibly think that you were engaged in the process of building a new world when that is your attitude? Because even the framing, and challenge me if you think I'm wrong,
Sure.
but even the framing of like ableist of these sort of projects, which that person completely engaged with as well, that's also a bit old worldy because
Hmm.
part of being in a structure like that, and I'm not saying an eco village, but like historically when people lived together, as you looked after each other. Oh, you can't
Yes.
work the land? No problem. You won't starve. We have surplus. There's probably something else you could do, like keep an eye on the children while, to make sure they don't
Yes.
fall over the waterfall or whatever it is, People were valued for lots of different reasons. They had such a potential richness to give. It wasn't just this like homo economicus, you only reap
Yes.
what you sow. I mean,
Yeah. I mean, there's you would hope. You would hope. I mean, there's
mm,
a long strain. This is again not to plug serious, but one of the
keep
kind of
plugging.
one of the currents that we look at is what some people call like disaster environmentalism, right? And
Mm,
there's definitely was in early period of the environmental movement, but really kind of going really it's been there forever, is this sense of like, well, this is just going to be a civilizational collapse and we're just not going to be able to protect and support everyone. And so people are going to have to die, right? That was one of the kind of animating impulses of early environmentalism, especially with its sort of focus on population, and sort of the kind of neo-Malthusian moment of it. And it's hard to, given the crisis that we're in, it's hard to deny that there's going to have to be some challenges and some trade-offs and unlimited growth in the way that is organized now. It doesn't seem realistic, but I want to be a little bit more optimistic and say, to your point about you know providing for everyone and everyone giving what they can. I mean, I think there's a way to sort of more equitably manage our resources and provide for everyone when those people with the two yachts and whatnot take a little bit less.
mm, mm,
Um, but definitely, back in those early days when I was spending time on those eco villages, it was very, very disaster
mm,
environmentalism. Um, and that's not to, dismiss it entirely because, it is a disaster, right? But I just hope that we can kind of look out for each other through that rather than sort of come to these conclusions. Garrett Hardin, for instance, famously author of Tragedy of the Commons, he's subject of one of our episodes, and he had this idea of kind of lifeboat ethics, this really, really
mm,
dark vision that essentially, our lifeboat could only support so many, and then the rest would have to die. And of course, that was a very kind of racialized vision as well.
mm.
I mean, for him, the problem was essentially the global south, and I think that's an impulse that we have to be very weary of and try to avoid as best as we can and try to provide for everyone.
Mm. Yeah, all right. I agree. And I really take gumption with the phrasing like people will have to, as if it's a kind of decree, essentially. But nonetheless, I think that the environmental movement, and I'm really not even sure what to really call it anymore, but does have to grapple with the fact that if we continue as we are, it's possibly 4 billion people will be dead in the next 30 years by 2050. That was a report published by the University of Exeter and the Faculty of Actuaries that looked at that.
Hmm.
So this is completely urgent and catastrophic. And no matter which way you slice it, things are going to change very, very dramatically. And I worry as well about I do think the human population should be capped, and I'm a strident feminist in that I think the very simple answer to that is good levels of education for girls, because that is the sort of single best way to help women choose the size of their own families. There is a direct correlate between the more
Mm-hmm.
years that a girl stays in education and the number of children that she has. So I don't really see a problem around the population conversation when you look at it like that. Obviously, when you look at it from the kind of like eugenics lens, that somebody else is choosing the size of women's families, then yes, of course,
Mm-hmm.
it's an issue. Um, but I do think that we are going to have very complicated conversations around the fact that, okay, the more that you centralize resources and systems,
Hmm.
essentially, the bigger an energy surplus that you need to maintain those things in order so that they can keep functioning. And that is typically why things always keep growing, because the surplus gets bigger, and so the output gets bigger, and then the surplus gets bigger, et cetera, et cetera. We are going to need some centralized systems globally throughout the world, like healthcare, for example. We're going to
Hmm.
need, hopefully, we're going to still have a kind of, like globalized level of certain things. I actually cannot think of the main one apart from healthcare. The production of certain pharmaceuticals, etc. Just whatever it is, even some energy systems. Like, even if you
Hmm.
want to deploy wind and solar in your own backyard, great. Who's making it? Probably China. Where are they getting those minerals from? Probably the Congo or any of the other 95% of the supply chain that they control? And so I'm very conscious of how do we look at the future as accurately as possible so that we're having conversations around the requisite surplus that we're going to have in order to protect the most vulnerable in society, and also how are we going to redirect surplus from the ineffable, the extravagant, the unnecessary, the two yachts, etc. You can have a fucking canoe, how about that? um in order to, as degrowth scholars say, sort of equitably redistribute. But I think that this is the challenge. It's not just a challenge because there's political power at play, obviously, that wants everything to sort of stay the same way. But also, I mean, that is a mass democratic decision that is going to have to be
Hmm.
taken, and a conversation that's going to have to be had democratically, unless we want it done in a sort of authoritarian or fascistic way. And fascism can take the form of environmentalism as well, where you say, need to protect nature, too many
Oh
people,
yeah.
off you trot?
Yeah. Yeah, not to be too dire. I mean, I'm kind of getting eco-fash vibes, in the future. I think
Yeah.
that's going to be the way, right? Little sort of gated enclaves that
Mm-hmm.
protect themselves from the worst of environmental disaster, environmental crisis, eco refugees that
Mm-hmm.
are,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
interned, that sort of thing. I mean, you could see it sort of happening already in some ways, right? Yeah, I mean, I don't know, like there's a lot to unpack there. There's a lot to answer to there. I mean, I think you're right that some sort of global cooperation to address the climate crisis and any environmental crisis is necessary because these are global dynamics. I think I have this sort of like aversion though to being too system oriented, I guess, for lack of a better term.
Oh,
To
interesting.
You have like Green Dreams is this season that is all about these like big environmental thinkers, these big sort of um, environmental intellectuals, and they're all brilliant people, but they're all blinded to something for some
Mm-hmm.
reason,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Mm-hmm.
and through that blindness, it kind of leads them to some pretty dark places. And I think that just comes from the nature of, I mean, to some extent, the kind of history of the modern environmental movement, especially in the United States, right, is a kind of intellectual, sort of middle class, upper middle class movement. That's improving. It's becoming, more diverse and more labor oriented, more social justice oriented, more oriented towards the global south. But when you have these kind of big intellectuals that have been for a long time sort of leaders, it's sometimes when you get to these moments of making these hard choices, you end up making choices that's really are just kind of serving yourself, your own race, your own class position, your own nation. So I wanted, to the best of our abilities, kind of try to decentralize that decision making and really just that impulse of how we think about the climate crisis. If we get too wedded to, hey, I have this, big vision of how much energy is necessary, and we need to, you know, deploy resources in this way from the sort of top down level, you can end up really damaging some communities, right? So So that's just like I said, it's sort of this ambivalence that I have between the big and the small, and trying to sort of balance having a realistic enough vision of sort of global challenges, but also not kind of enshrining a new global elite to sort of solve our climate crisis. I think it's going to have to be sort of the new sustainable and just world is going to have to be one that's sort of collectively authored.
I completely agree with you. That's why I think that sort of distribution of resources
Mhm.
with regards to what we need to stay centralized has to be democratic, and people have
Yeah.
to be sort of in charge of themselves. Like I sort of see a sort of socialist libertarianism or a sort of
Hmm.
communal like anarchism, something where like this the sovereign the political sovereignty is at least handed back to people, and frankly we will have to mostly make do with what is available to us around us mostly, I
Yeah.
think. um but I disagree with you about the idea of things like the fear or the vision being a mostly kind of white intellectual position. Because if you had said that to anyone from Tonga, whose
Hmm.
island is disappearing under rising sea levels, they're not white intellectuals. They are experiencing an existential crisis where the land that has supported their culture for thousands of years is going to disappear. And other Pacific Island nations are already taking in refugees from Tuvalu,
Hmm.
which is also sinking under the water, or rather being swallowed under the water. There's Everybody is going to have to go from there. Everybody in the next 20 years, it will be completely gone. In
Hmm.
other island nations, the elders talk about the fact that in their lifetimes, you, the beaches have disappeared, the land is disappearing. Like it's a part of the world where it, it it's happening already. It's already happening to them. And that is truly existential to lose your land, because that is the beginning of your culture being lost, your language being lost, being assimilated into another kind of culture, really. If you say, and I think that for me, this is part of the problem with regards to communicating what could happen. It's not to say what will happen, but what could. And I think that there's an element of Western people's Western people forgetting how bad things can be. I would say maybe as a group, the Jewish people in Europe, they remember how bad things can be because it was less than 100 years ago that they were targeted for genocide. But that conversation hasn't continued very well out with that group. Like that's something that we're taught, about World War II, but it's, increasingly sort of put aside, hushed. The fact of, the United States sort of being involved, or the CIA at least, in sort of toppling democratic governments around the world that were offering a different vision. The fact that the world could have been a completely different place had it been left to the democratic process, 50 years ago. Um, the fact of slavery having been around for 1,000 years before it was ended, or maybe even more. Um, the fact of the human population already sort of coming to the brink of collapse at different points in history. The mass extinction events that have happened. I mean, now we're going really deep time, but bad things do happen very fast. And I feel like it's quite difficult for those of us who live, frankly, lives of luxury compared to the vast majority of our species' history to really grapple with what could be next.
Yeah, I mean, definitely a challenge. Like, first thing I just wanted to say, like, I
Mm,
absolutely agree with you in terms of like indigenous leadership in the climate movement, small island nations, like really growing in prominence and
mm,
being kind of put at the forefront more and more. I mean, that's changed in the last couple decades. That I think is a change that ought to be celebrated from kind of earlier periods of environmentalism, which it's really the focus of what I've been doing recently. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the question about do we can we comprehend or appreciate the suffering that is going to happen, the challenge, sort of existential challenge of climate change? No, I think you're right. We probably don't. We don't. We just don't understand the challenge that is sort of facing us, we put on all sorts of blinders, all sorts of cognitive dissonances. Um, but I mean, people struggle all over the world, right? I mean, if you ask someone in the West who is, struggling, living paycheck to paycheck, in and out of secure housing, whether they know challenges. I mean, yes, they do. So every context is a little bit different. I don't want to make too, broad sweeping generalizations of, global South or communities in Europe versus the United States or Canada. I mean, that's sort of everywhere. But I think your point is generally well taken that there's some kind of like immense possible suffering, probable. I mean, even right now, there's immense climate suffering. Obviously, droughts and heat waves and all sorts of extreme weather events, sea level rise, and people have a kind of cognitive dissonance. They just can't accept that. That's something that's hard to puncture.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that obviously I agree that the suffering is global. And I was just with an Aboriginal community recently. And the elders were so wonderful, so wise, so generous with regards to their offering of an understanding of the bigger picture. And I mean, these people, where they are in Australia, they were only colonized violently about 150 years ago. It was the last place in Australia for the settlers reached. And a truly vicious history of colonization there. And they said it's everywhere. The violence that we have experienced is everywhere. It's all over the world. It's in our history. They were talking about Palestine, and weeping for the children of Gaza. And I just thought that was an incredibly generous and beautiful thing to sort of braid together, if you will, because yes, the suffering is global. I just feel like there's other communities that remember what it is to experience an existential threat.
hmm Yeah, I think that's a point well taken. But I think that's a beautiful point too on the kind of solidarity. I mean, specifically between like indigenous people and Palestine and the kind of like decolonial energies. I think have actually emboldened the sort of movement for justice in Palestine, and I think that's part of the reason, and the environmental movement too. I mean, I think it's just becoming a lot more social justice oriented, intersectional, I guess, for lack of a better term, where these kind of social solidarities are being built. And I think that's just sort of strengthening us all.
I hope so. I mean, I have to say that the cynic in me goes, maybe, but I'm not sure how much solidarity has actually helped anything in the
Mm,
past sort of 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Like it is a good thing emotionally. It's an important thing politically, but if it's not translating into material change, I'm not
hmm
sure, actually how it is strengthening. And I'm thinking of, I can't remember if I've already said this on the show, but I'm talking about it to everyone all the time at the moment. There was a clip of a musician at Glastonbury. I cannot for the life of me remember his name. He was not from Europe. And he got up on stage and he said, I keep hearing, free Palestine, free Congo, free Sudan. And I say to you, free Europe. And I was like, that's good. That's good. That's really good. My reaction was, that is really important.
Yeah.
Yes, free Europe. Like, it's not as if we're sitting from a privileged position relatively, but it's not as if we're actually sitting from a position of power where our statements and our campaigns and our actions translate into
Yes.
differences.
That's funny. That reminds me of I think it was Gandhi that was once asked by a journalist or something, what do you think about Western civilization? And his answer was, that'd be a good idea. Yeah, so I feel that, yeah, we should get our own house in order, for sure.
Part of really what we're talking about here is also how to speak to people and how to communicate all of these ideas. And I know that you're not researching how to communicate catastrophe, but you are researching how to communicate in science. And given you've created this tried and tested method, what's the phrase? Tried and true? True and tried? Tried and tested?
Tried and true. Yeah, I guess
Tried and
so.
true?
Yeah.
Given, let me just say it differently. Given you've created this, oh wow, no, can't my brain, tried and true? Given you've created this tried and true method with the podcast of how to do collaborative research and pluralistic research and translate that into these seasons that win awards and really inform people about the bigger picture of whatever topic it is that you're interested in that season, I would love to learn what you have learned really from how it is that you communicate effectively to people. And even if we have the time, how it is that you collaborate effectively with people, given, some parts of this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess sort of broad strokes, I've been a journalist reporting on the politics of science and research and academia for like over 15 years now. And my kind of main gig is running this organization called Cited Media, which supports and produces many different podcasts. And the kind of flagship one that we're talking about today is called Cited, and we have this season about environmental politics. And the kind of approach that I've taken to producing content is, very much kind of like evidence-based, very much about science and research. But we kind of, I want to say, like, decenter the expert to a certain extent and realize that there are these kind of like epistemic boundaries or divides between the kind of credentialed, capital S scientist, capital E expert, and the general public who is sometimes weary and sometimes distrustful or sometimes just lives in a different world and it doesn't kind of resonate the way they speak or the concerns that they have. And so I've always taken this approach, both in our storytelling and in our production. So there's many ways to answer this question. In our production, it's essentially an approach that integrates many different voices into the creation of a podcast. So we create podcasts that are done in collaboration with scholars where they help develop the research and the ideas and help suggest just people and places and, possible topics. But then we have our own kind of expertise as journalists. And sometimes we work with community groups and activist organizations, and we kind of all come together in this messy, somewhat chaotic approach to podcast development and create something that is not just about kind of dutifully transmitting the expertise of those in academia, but is something unique that actually sort of synthesizes many different perspectives and worldviews and methodologies and approaches. And it's really in those kind of tensions and those negotiations where you can bridge these divides and make really interesting work, really challenging work, right? Challenging for the scientists as much as it is for the general public. So, and then in the storytelling, it's kind of the same, right? It's like a lot of our programming is essentially about the politics of science and research, where we take a quite critical stance, even against people that are kind of, well-meaning, and try to reveal some of the blind spots or how maybe an activist movement might see things differently, or some of the sort of, I guess, like say, it's productive tensions, right? It's not about being anti-science and pro-movement or whatever. It's about seeing where those kinds of tensions are and how those can be productive politically or scientifically or whatever the case may be. So that's kind of the broad strokes of Cited Media, at least.
Fantastic. I love it. I love the whole process of it. I love the idea of, the role of your cited team to essentially be the trellis that kind of supports this organic growth of something, and that you can't really be too sure what it will be by the end. And I also love your commitment to challenging and engaging in sort of an important researched critique of everything that you're coming across, because I mean, this will also be people that you've developed good relationships with. And that is often the hardest thing. It's when you have worked closely with somebody, or, they've been involved in some way, you like them as a person, and you still need to engage in that sort of journalistic rigor. It's really, really, really hard. And I think that that's what speaks to, Cited's success, quite frankly, and the fact that it is sort of a cut above the rest, the fact that you're managing to do both of these things.
Hmm.
It's very good, Gordon.
Thank you. Thank you. That means a lot, Rachel. Those are kind words. Yeah, yeah, we also don't produce as much. I mean, we're kind of slow, and I think that's maybe why, right? I mean, it takes a lot of relationship building and also like just bureaucratic stuff, like
Yeah.
making stuff kind of quasi academically within and around these various institutions also takes time. So I'd say it's not like an approach that every type of show or every type of journalist can take, at least sort of structurally. Um, but I think it is an approach philosophically that one can take. So I'm also on the side doing a PhD. I'm very busy, and my PhD is in a similar kind of area. It's in education, but it's basically in public understanding of science and sort of the politics of, especially public distrust. I mean, climate change comes up, as do other topics. But one thing I was going to say there, one kind of little sort of theoretical nugget I can offer from the kind of corpus of science communication literature is that for decades, scholars have attacked and really discredited, I would say, this notion of a public deficit or an informational deficit. And the notion of a public deficit or an informational deficit is essentially just the kind of assumption that many science communication halls used to have, and many people still have, that essentially the problem, if someone sort of distrusts science or if there's some kind of divide between an expert and a general public, the problem is always some kind of deficit within the public. They just don't know, they just don't understand, they're misled. And really, that's just like usually not the case. I mean, they may be misled about something, they may have some kind of, we all have, informational deficits. But generally, when people look at these kinds of, conflicts, there is a deeper social, political, historical divide. There's a tension. Sometimes it's the tension that's, they know full well why they're distrusting an expert. It's because the experts are wrong, or maybe they just have a different political ideology, and that's just kind of, that's the bottom line. So in science communication, this idea of kind of like putting the expert on the stage and deifying them and saying, okay, expert discovers X, therefore public ought to, comply. It just doesn't work for so many reasons. So we have to do something different. Cited is trying to do that as well, right? With kind of having multiple viewpoints in our storytelling. But I would just encourage anyone that's doing sort of science communication to, like, in a way, decenter science, right? Which is like a tricky thing to do because we get into this line of work because we love science and we see all these great ideas coming out of the academy and we're excited about them, but we have to see their limitations. We have to see them from the perspective of the people that don't identify in the same way as we do.
I think that's a really wonderful nugget. And for me, it kind of speaks to, again, the vast majority of our species history, in which if somebody you didn't know, a stranger came along and started talking to you about something, you'd be like, don't care. Who are you? Like, there's
Yes.
no consensus here, which helps me understand whether or not I should trust you, because we are not in relationship with each other.
Yes.
You know?
That's just, yeah.
So like it's technically quite a smart evolutionary, social move there. I've got a friend who works in comms. He's brilliant. And he likes to remind me that only about 10% of people will sort of change their mind or listen to information through the logos way, i.e., through stats and
Mhm.
direct information and facts. And 20% or 30% of people will change it because of pathos, like emotion, essentially, if you speak to them
Yeah.
emotionally. And the remaining percentage will change the mind through the last one that I can't remember. But essentially, it's through a figure of someone they trust, like
Right.
through not necessarily
Yes.
authority, but someone they perceive as having a relationship with. And when he found out and he called me up and he was like, this is it. This is why Donald Trump can get up on stage and lie. And his followers just go, yeah, cool. I trust him.
Yes. Yeah. No, I think that's exactly like you put it brilliantly. It's all about kind of relation. And I mean, when I say we, I mean, I don't mean we because I am so enculturated into academia. I'm just
Mm,
such a creature of this world. But that's not everyone, right? And
mhm,
so a lot of people, they don't have this kind of relation or this identification with these institutions of higher learning. For a lot of people, these are places that they resent or the
mhm,
places that they've been excluded from or
mhm,
that they've had bad experiences in or they just have never had access to. And so that relationship just doesn't exist there. And then yeah, like in the person of Donald Trump, it's a good point, right? Like I think so many people have this identification with him, largely because he's been this like media creature for so long,
yeah.
but they feel like he's their guy, right? He's
Yeah.
lying for
Yeah.
them. He's
Yeah.
sticking it to the man for them. Um, yeah, absolutely. So but I never put those numbers on it. But I think that's on your friend there is onto something in terms of those ratios. That seems really quite apt. I mean, so much of it is just a kind of our social environment, right? And that
Mhm,
our identities and the people that we identify with.
mhm. Well, I can call him up and ask him to send me through his source because he sources everything. He's amazing. He's always cited. Ding ding ding.
Yeah.
Gordon, I think that on my terrible joke, that's where we should probably wrap it up. My final question for you is who would you like to platform?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've been thinking of a few folks that I've talked to in the making of this series. And we had this one episode on sort of space evangelists who want to colonize the moon, right? And for like its limitless resources.
Hate those
And
guys.
yeah. And we spoke to this one sort of science and technology and religious studies scholar named Mary Jane Rubenstein. And she had a book called Astrotopia, which I thought was just so fascinating because it took a kind of religious studies approach to these kind of narratives of space exploration. And at first when I heard it, like, oh, like these guys are religious figures, I was kind of skeptical because they seem so kind of vulgarly atheist, right? I mean, like
Mm,
they are
mm,
not they
mm,
are the most godless people around. But they still kind of fall back on these kind of narratives of like manifest destiny and those sorts of things. I found that book really fascinating. And then there's just so many like interesting environmental podcasters that I've spoken to recently and discovered and become a listener of. I mean, Planet Critical being one of them, obviously, but I will say out in BC, where I'm from, Future Ecologies is very interesting. Really, really cool work. Definitely would check them out. Crazy Town. They push back on some of these techno futurist narratives. Those are really interesting. And Tech Won't Save Us, another Canadian podcaster
Paris Marx.
who's
Yeah.
Paris, yes, who's excellent on sort of techno solutionism, including some climate related and environment related episodes. So, yeah, those are just a few plugs.
Excellent. I love that you came and platformed other podcasts. You could have just platformed this Green Dreams, your new one that's coming out. So that's very generous of you. That's really in the spirit, I think, of everything we've been discussing, Gordon. Before I let you go, where can people find Green Dreams?
Citedpodcast.com, and that's cited like citation, so CITED, or anywhere that you find your podcasts. First episode is coming out second week of September, and we'll have a trailer drop the first week. So, yeah, this fall.
Wonderful. Gordon, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Rachel.
If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.